Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Ghouls Magazine panel discussion, The Ones Who Did Not Die, The Final Girls of Horror. My name is Rebecca McCallum, and I am a writer of horror think pieces for places such as Rue Morgue, Grim Magazine, and Dread Central, and I also happen to be assistant editor at Ghouls Magazine. So, are you into survival? Do you enjoy levitating in the woods with witches? Have you ever seen the boogeyman on Halloween night? Well, hopefully only the first two replied. Tonight, I will be your host as we fight back, lay traps, and hopefully live to tell the tale. And we are keeping it ghoulish as I will be joined by four incredible final ghouls from our amazing team of contributors to talk to me one-on-one about their favourite final girls and much, much more. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome my first guest, Jerry Sampson. Hi, Jerry. How are you?
Hey, Rebecca. I'm good. How are you? I'm excited to talk about all things horror all the time.
I'm so excited to have you here. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Yeah, of course.
So, my first question to you is, the term "the final girl" was first coined by Carol Clover in her book Men, Women and Chainsaws, and often it's associated with the slasher boom of the 70s and 80s. Why then do you think that decades later the final girl is still so popular?
I think a lot of us are really holding on to like that nostalgia of those movies, right? So we can see it in sort of how difficult it's been to get lasting final girls, like probably after Sydney Prescott. Because we all look back and really those girls and sometimes boys are our eyes and ears, and a lot of times there would be an entire group of kids that were just sort of insufferable. And then you would have the one who was relatable and, even as she kind of transitioned through the years from maybe a virginal, all the rules that applied to the final girls back in the 80s, transitioned to have a little more agency, a little more control. And I feel like we really appreciate the fear and the thrills of the slasher film, but we need to have that kind of grounding person that we can follow and root for. Otherwise, you're kind of just living in this bleak world. And that's not really what slashers are. Like slashers, most of the time, are fun, energetic, and exciting. And we want our final girls to exist beyond that moment in time where their lives are just being brutalized.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I often look at the final girls and think, well, if they can survive such ordeals, then I'm going to be okay.
That's it, exactly. I mean, especially as, female fans and women fans who probably grew up with a lot of, warnings and don't go down that dark hallway or that dark alleyway. Don't go by yourself anywhere. And usually at the end of the film, the final girls are left alone, right, to defend themselves and to fight those monsters that are chasing them. And I think there's a lot of relatability in that, even if we're never chased by some crazed maniac, mentally, we are a lot of our lives. So,
exactly.
It's just that connection. Yeah.
I like that idea of us perhaps being able to explore those sort of dark corners of life with the final girls, with the alleyways and the things that, terrify us. But if we do that with the final girls, there's a sense of not being alone.
Exactly. And with a really well-written and, lasting final girl, I think that's why it persists. And, there have been a few kind of in the past 20 years, but really, I think we'll find a lot of like probably the conversations or a lot of feedback that we might get on this is like, yes, Nancy and, Sydney. And it's just harder to find kind of the really long lasting, even though there are some, but I don't know. It's a lot of nostalgia with the slasher craze,
Yeah.
I think.
And that leads me into my next question, which is about, as well as the classic final girls, we also have a lot of contemporary final girls. What are your thoughts about how the final girl has evolved since the 70s and 80s and how she presents now?
Yeah, there are some really incredible current day final girls, but I do think that we've come to a point where we're leaning a lot on, obviously this is all the rage right now, like the legacy final girls. And for me, as much as that nostalgia love is there, I'm way more drawn to, the Aarons, if we're talking in the past, 20 years in the aughts and beyond, the Aarons of your next and Thomason, and there are some really beautiful examples of like current final girls. And I think also that the ones that really last are the ones that are given agency and they're making decisions. So if we look at like old school final girls, they're kind of thrust into a situation and they have to react, right? Because it's either react or die. And now we've got a lot of women that are like actively stalking their prey. Like, I won't leave until I have finished this, person off. Erin is a great example of that. And I just think that's the big difference. Now we need a final girl who's going to actually run straight into the fire as opposed to constantly running from, and I think that's just how we've sort of evolved. We don't want to see somebody just kind of reacting. We want to see an active woman and, again, sometimes final boys, kind of really attacking their attacker. And I think that is kind of an evolution of the final girl that we see a lot more nowadays, which I appreciate.
And so ahead of this panel then, I asked all my guests to pick one final girl that they would like to talk about. And you chose Jodie from Cherry Falls, which has recently dropped onto Shudder here. So there's been a lot of interesting new discourse around the film. So I'm really excited to hear what you've got to say about Jodie. So could you tell us more about your experiences with her and what she means to you?
Yeah, Cherry Falls has kind of a sordid history. It was censored heavily when it was released. It was meant to be released in 2000 in like theaters, but for whatever reason, it was like a $14 million movie, and the censors were just like, we are not doing this. And I'm pretty sure it has to do with the content, which we'll kind of get into. But so it was released on a TV, like heavily cut. And I think that was the first time I had seen it, and I didn't really get it. I didn't really like it, and it was kind of like whatever. And then it was released sort of in its form how it was meant to be, and it's the weirdest slasher. It is so strange. It is so kind of depraved, and and Jodie is played by Brittany Murphy, is one of the weirdest characters like in a slasher. She is more like, she's got these ways of moving. Brittany Murphy, I think the director was just like, Jeffrey Wright was just like, do what you want, because there are moments in this movie where she is acting so strangely but so captivating. She's like a ghoul. She's like walking around. She's very wide-eyed, and it's all about daddy. And there's also a lot of kind of strange moments of implied incest, and I mean, but she's also like she's a really funny, badass character who, when it comes down to it, again, she's actively is warning people about what's going on. She's kind of running head on into the fire, and I just think I was drawn to her strangeness. I mean, there's a moment in Cherry Falls where Jodie gets out of bed and it's almost like she's sleepwalking to the window and she's reaching her hand out in this weird way and she just whispers "daddy," and I think her eyes are closed, and it's just, you're watching and it's got like a good amount of, gore and those good old slasher chase scenes. There's a great scene in the school with a shark, and she just gets very feral, just like she's like a little animal when she really activates, and that's what I love about her. I mean, she's just not a passive person. She's not a passive girl. And so I was always really drawn to her.
Yeah, it's a captivating performance as well, isn't it? But that film is balls to the wall.
It really is. It really is. And I've said before, and I think a lot of people have said, like, Laura Lee, who is the baddie in the film, walked so that Gabriel from Malignant could run. Like, it's that kind of balls to the walls. Like, it's an extreme performance from everyone, and it's hilarious.
There's something for everyone.
I love a good yeah.
It feels like it would be it's a great sort of communal film.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, especially from the very beginning, I have to say, Cherry Falls, from the opening frame to the very end, is so funny and dark and twisted, and it's pretty much like everything that I look for in 2000s, early 2000s, late 90s fare. Just fun, light, and totally messed up.
It's a little time capsule, isn't it, in and of itself, I think.
It really is. It really is. Everything from the hair to the wardrobe to the way that these kids act and talk. And it's also a movie that revolves around, kind of flipping the game on slashers. Like, typically old school slashers, you got to be a virgin, you got to not drink, you got to be wholesome. And the whole point of Cherry Falls is that if you're a virgin, you die. So what ends up happening is nobody wants to die, so everybody gets to banging.
And so then, looking ahead to the future, some people might say the Final Girl, like particularly you mentioned before about returning to the Final Girl and exploring her through prequels, sequels, reboots, the whole kabam. Some may argue that the Final Girl is outdated now and overdone, tired. What would you say to that? And where do you see the Final Girl going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I don't think she's ever outdated or done. We're all just we're in a pretty dark place, and all of us together. And you want somebody to root for. You always want somebody to root for, and whether you like a really good bleak horror movie or a really fun light slasher, you still need somebody to kind of focus on and love. And while I don't think that we're going to have the same kind of Nancy's and Sydney's and Sally's, I guess, going forward, just because I don't think that nostalgia is quite as strong now. There's just not a lot of those. We've got so much coming out, so much big studio horror and independent horror, and it's harder to kind of focus on like what's these Final Girls to really last. And so, well, I don't think she's gonna be done. I do think it's gonna be a lot of old school coming back to fight their demons, and until they run out of those women, and then we're just gonna have to like create cool, good, strong characters and new, interesting, fun stories, so that even if we don't have anybody that we can root for 50 years, at least we'll have somebody in the moment that we can really latch onto and identify ourselves in. So I don't know. I'm always rooting I'm always rooting for new, interesting content. And then also, like, I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for
same.
30 and 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah, and I'm always
They'll never die. They'll never die.
Yeah, never die. Final girls never say die. Yeah, I'm always interested as well to see, you know, where people take sort of the older final girls, and that's something that interests me a lot. You know, like Laurie in Halloween 2018, and we've had Sydney as well this year. So I like that that's opened up that element as well of like the older final girls. So yeah. Well, Jerry, it has been so lovely talking to you.
Yeah, you too, Rebecca.
I wish we could talk longer, and I'm sure we will at some point. But before you go, could you just please tell everybody a little bit about who you are, what you do, and where we can find you online? Because I know you've got your fingers in all the pies.
Yeah, well, I'm a horror screenwriter and writer. I have a book of short horror fiction out, and I've got several projects that are in the works with several scripts. And I'm on Twitter. I think that's on the screen right now. I'm also on Instagram at The Sleeper Must Awaken. And I don't know, I'm trying to get my hands in as many pies as possible and see something come to fruition, because I love horror films, love horror fiction. Everything about it is pretty much my life, as we all know. And I write for Ghouls. I write reviews and editorials, and I just started a little editorial piece on upcoming directors. So like kind of independent film directors. It's going to be coming out on Ghouls soon. So look for that. And yeah, I'll just be out here writing horror.
Thanks so much for taking time out to be with us, Jerry. And yeah, final girls never say die.
Never say die. Thanks, Rebecca.
Bye, Jerry.
Bye.
And now I would like to welcome my second guest, Jen Adams. Hi, Jen. Ooh.
Sorry.
There we go.
Hi, how are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you.
Hello.
You were right at the top of my list of people to speak to about final girls.
Oh, I love them.
You do. I don't know anyone who loves them more. And you've written so many incredible articles about them. I think I once called you the Laurie Strode Scholar, which is a title well earned, I'd say.
Oh, thank you. Yes, she is one of my favorites. I love her. I love them all. Like, they all have a place in my heart, you know.
So before we get into it then, would you just please introduce yourself and say who you are and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. My name is Jen Adams, and I am a podcaster and writer, and I am a co-host of the Losers Club podcast, which is about Stephen King, and the Psychoanalysis podcast about mental health and horror. And I also write for various places, including the Fabulous Ghouls, whereas I've written a lot about Laurie for Ghouls, and currently working on a piece about Sally. So, you know, Final Girls are.
We love it. Just keep feeding us with the Final Girl articles.
Well, it's like, I feel like it's a bottomless well of like things that I have to say about them. So, yeah.
Yeah. Just when you think you're done, you just unearth something else, don't you?
Totally. Yeah. There's another one. Yeah.
So then, the Final Girls. Often our first thought is to go to those famous slashers of the 70s and 80s. But why do you think then that so many years since, the Final Girl continues to be so popular and adored by the horror community?
Well, I think Final Girls stand on their own, so I don't ever want to talk about them connected to the monster, but they do kind of exist as a mirror of this monstrous force, and the monster's not gone. You know, like, I think I read slashers, the killers in slashers, I read that as patriarchy a lot. You know, it's this like omnipresent male force that is always there, always kind of lurking out of the shadows, always watching, always judging, and never stops. And so that is still very much present in our world. And so I think we still need our final girls to are kind of our avatars for fighting that. That's how we kind of channel how we combat them, and they give us the inspiration, and the monster keeps coming, but the final girl keeps fighting or keeps running, and keeps going. And so I think as long as that monster is still there, we're always going to have final girls that we love and we need.
Yeah, and we're surrounded by plenty of monsters at the moment, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Yeah, and the past couple of years have felt, they've been rearing their heads a lot, which I think is partly why we are seeing the return of some of our original final girls. Is because I think we want the newer ones, but we also want those sources. Like Laurie, she just holds such a special place in my heart and so many other people's hearts, and Sydney, and just. So it's like this comfort to shorthand comfort, that when we see them, because we know they're still here too, like 70,
Absolutely.
50 years later, not 70.
Yeah.
I'm not going to date them more.
So then, along with the original final girls, we've had some amazing contemporary final girls. I'm thinking of Danny in Midsummer, for example, and Celia in The Invisible Man. What are your thoughts about how the final girl has evolved in recent years?
Well, I tend to be a little bit persnickety about who I consider final girls. And I don't say that in a gatekeepery kind of a way. I just I think it's just because I read Men, Women, and Chainsaws, and that has just formed a lot of my understanding of horror, even though I do think it's relatively dated. So when I look at newer final girls, I don't know if I necessarily see the final girl evolving as much as I see just kind of an expansion of roles for women in horror. There are just I feel like there are a lot of new channels that women can have roles in. They can be the killer, they can be the kind of bad girl, but not the main villain, or they can be a survivor, or they can be a victim, but still empowered. And I just think in the 70s and 80s, when I think the final girl really kind of emerged, there were really only really two things that women could really be most of the time. And I mean, I'm speaking, I don't want to be limiting, because there's a world of film and a world of characters, but I feel like it was either you're a victim or you're the final girl or you're the killer. And they were so rarely the killer. And so now I see the final girl is still alive and well, but I think there are just so many other things that women can be, which is what really excites me. So when I think I look at the evolution of the final girl, I look at these returning final girls, and I'm trying to think of a way to I kind of want to call them the final matriarch or something. I don't, something to kind of denote that they are returning. And I'm still kind of playing around with that in my head, but I love revisiting them and seeing what they've been doing and where their trauma has led them and how they've dealt with that. And I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, but yeah, I think that's the thing that I like to really focus on with final girls is the return,
I like the notion that potentially the original final girls have paved the way for these more complex female roles across horror in general.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's a matriarchy. Yeah. And that is one of the most exciting things I think about the final girls returning is if I look at most notably, there's Sydney, and then there's Sally in this most recent Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And then there's Laurie, of course, in Halloween H2O and in Halloween 2018. I kind of like to forget that Resurrection exists because I'm still mad about it. But they don't exist in their movies alone. There is another final girl that they work with, and they kind of, I don't necessarily want to say they pass the torch, because that implies that they are leaving, but because I don't think they're leaving. I think they just lead us, they show I have survived this. You can survive this too. Here's what I've learned, and here's what I can teach you, and here's what I can learn from you too. And so that's what I think is the most exciting thing about Final Girls returning, is that they're surviving with other people, which is something that we didn't really see very much in the 70s and 80s.
No. And so you've chosen to talk about Sydney in Scream, and she graced our screens again at the beginning of this year in Scream 2022, which was really exciting.
It was, yes.
So I can't wait to hear your thoughts about Sydney. So what's your relationship with her, and what does she mean to you personally?
Well, she just will always have my heart. She's probably my favorite character in all of fiction. I just absolutely am in love with her. I have this really clear memory of going to see Scream when I was 16 in the theater, and I had just gotten my driver's license. And like, I remember to the point, like, I remember what I was wearing, and it was just this memory of like this turning point for me, because I'd grown up being really into Stephen King, but this was a new kind of horror that I could relate to in a different kind of way. And she was my age, and so I think like her references were my references, and I didn't know that much about horror, but I knew that I loved her, and I knew that I found her so empowering. And I love, now that I've learned a lot more about horror, I can kind of see her as a turning point that really excites me. It's kind of like what I was just saying, like she's really one of the first notable Final Girls. I feel like I'm going to insult a Final Girl that I love when I say that, so I apologize to anyone that I'm discounting. But I feel like she is really one of the first Final Girls that does not survive alone. She is really empowered. She, like, as Alex West says in her book, like, she takes charge of her narrative, and she is in control. She has that decisive kill at the end, which is fantastic. And she survives with Gale. And I think I really enjoy seeing a female or two women have a friendship with each other that is nuanced, and that was something that I struggled with as I was growing up. And so I think that was kind of inspiration for me. They don't always love each other. They don't always get along, but we don't have to, and I think I love that she kind of creates her own rules too, like she has sex with Billy. And, I think we put a lot of I think there's this kind of myth of how strict the rules were, with slashers. Yeah. But I always, I don't like people telling me what to do. So I liked that she does what she wants to do. It's her story, just that, like, she won my heart when she said not in my movie, because that told me I could have my own movie. This is my story, and I can make it what I want. And then we see her come back in every movie. Like, it's not Michael, it's not Leatherface, it's not Jason, it's her face. And she's the one who keeps coming back. And so we see this evolution of her trauma and her healing. And that was really, I think it inspired me before I knew I needed that inspiration. Like, I was watching this when I was like in college and like a young adult, and like, in just really hard times in my life. But she just showed me that you keep going, and you keep coming back.
Yeah, and I love that potentially with you saying that your first experience, you were a similar age, that perhaps you've evolved with Sydney as well over the years.
I think I have, yeah. I mean, and like the easy way to see that, I think, is that she wrote a book about her trauma, and I've written a lot about mine. But I think I think she has, in seeing her kind of learn to trust people and learn to set boundaries for herself, but also stay smart about who she trusts and open up about her trauma, but not use it. And I think I have evolved with her, and I hadn't thought about that until you said that, but now I think I'm going to cry.
I love that you put your hands on your heart when you talk about it as well. I really feel it.
I just love her. Oh, and speaking of, like, I have recently fallen in love with Gale too, because I think she is just as much a Final Girl as Sydney is, and I think she doesn't get the credit that she's due oftentimes. So
yeah, and I think, as you say, the two of them are very different, but when they're together, something really special happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, they really complement each other well, and And it's just such a great model of a female friendship over the years, that grows and changes because they're in different stages of their lives, like we all are,
Yeah. And so if we were to look ahead into the future then, what do you think the place of the final girl is within the horror genre, and how do you think she'll be received in 5-10 years' time?
Gosh, I don't know. Well, I mean, going back to the very first thing I said, as long as there's a patriarchy, there's always going to be a final girl. And I unfortunately don't see that ending anytime soon. So I think we are going to keep seeing these really strong final girls. I love the trend that we've been seeing of final girls working together. And I like, where I don't know if I can think of a really good example of this, but that they don't always have to be girls,
Yeah.
Like I love that. I don't know if I would consider Dewey a final girl, but he does survive with them and he becomes part of, like in Stephen King terms, the quartet. And so I love just this example of female leadership and this kind of exploration of trauma. I think one of the things that I love about Halloween 2018 is that it begins with people kind of discounting her experience and it ends with them believing her. And so I think as we keep seeing these stories come up and the monsters keep coming and more people believe her, and not necessarily that this happened, but that this hurts and that this still hurts and that we need to work together to keep it from hurting. And that's, I think, the thing that I love the most about Sydney is that she lets, as much as she has issues with trust, understandably, she lets people in and she lets people help her. And she does depend on other people because we can't do it alone. Like I think back to some of the original final girls, and sometimes I just think about how lonely they must feel, and I think that's partly why we see Sally and Laurie coming back, is because they really didn't have anybody else, and I want the final girls going forward to have this well of women that they can call on for support and strength. Because I mean, I'm talking about them as if they're real people because they feel real to me, because when I need strength and support, I go to them,
Same, exactly. They're such good facilitators of healing, aren't they? And like for thinking things through, and yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Jen, I could talk to you all night.
I know, me too. But maybe my favorite thing to talk about in the world. So thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this.
Oh, no, it's been a pleasure, and we'll have to have a catch up sometime soon.
Oh, absolutely.
We can take the whole day, and I'll bring a pot of tea. And yeah.
Absolutely.
Before you pop off then, could you share your social links and where we can find all your fantastic articles and podcasts so that I can circulate those with the discussion after the panel?
Well, you can find me on Jen Ferratu on Twitter and Instagram, and that's Jen with 2 N's, but it's on the screen, so you can see that. And you can find me co-hosting the Losers Club podcast, which is the Losers Club pod on socials, and Psycho A Pod, and you should check out Rebecca's fantastic episode about A Nightmare on Elm Street because she was a marvelous guest talking about another fantastic final girl. And you can find me writing just in a lot of places. I am working on a lot of pieces about Sally right now because she's kind of top of my mind, including one about Sally and trauma for Ghouls, and hopefully to be starting a column about trauma and how it is represented in film. So, yeah.
I'm so excited for it. Okay, well, thanks so much, Jen. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hope to speak to you soon.
You too. Thank you.
Bye now. Bye-bye. And so, before I get on my next guest, I would just like to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to everyone who is watching this event live right now. For anyone who doesn't know us, Ghouls is an indie horror magazine written through the female perspective. If you like what we do and you'd like to support us, then you can do so by becoming a Ghouls member. But what does being a Ghouls member get me, I hear you say? Well, you will get exclusive access to monthly content, including editorials, videos, podcast episodes, extra money off our fabulous merchandise, and the chance to be involved in panels such as this one tonight. but most importantly of all, your support helps to keep us going. So thank you so much. And we would like to offer everybody who's watching this event live now 1 month free membership. Simply use the code FINALGIRL, that's FINALGIRL, all capitals, all one word, at the checkout to redeem your offer. We are sure you'll love our content, but if you don't, then no worries. You can cancel your subscription at any time. Please see the banner below on the screen now for more details. And once again, thank you so much for your support and for being here with us tonight. So, on with the show, I would like to welcome my third guest, Ariel Powershrub. Ariel, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Hello. And I love that t-shirt. You're rocking a Slumber Party Massacre t-shirt.
I had to.
You have to. It's the rules.
Yep.
So before we get going, would you just like to briefly introduce yourself to everyone and say who you are and what you do?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for this discussion. So I'm Ariel Powershrub, and I am the administrative assistant for Ghouls Magazine, where I also contribute, and I also write for Moving Pictures Film Club. And I love thinking about horror, watching horror, reading horror, talking about horror. So you can find me on all corners of the internet doing that.
Thanks so much. So, when we think of Final Girls, our minds usually go to Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Why do you think then that so many years later we're still thinking and talking about the Final Girl?
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with a lot of what's been said already, and I don't want to repeat anyone, but I do think it's very important to acknowledge that there's always going to be room for women in horror in many different roles and many different capacities, one of which being the final girl. I don't think that's ever going to go away. And that still resonates today because people want someone to survive. Women want to see themselves survive. It's quite a trope to watch horror movies and go, oh, I would make these decisions differently, or they should have done this. And so everybody wants kind of a audience surrogate to follow to say, yes, this person made all the right choices and they got out of it. And well, that has changed over time. Our desire to cheer for someone, to see ourselves in someone, that hasn't gone away and that won't go away. So the big time final girls of the original slashers and the final girls of today, some of whom are the ones coming back from those franchises and some that are brand new, there's kind of something for everybody. If you're looking for someone to cheer for, there's a final girl out there for you.
There's a final girl for everybody.
Yeah, I think that there is.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned about the almost putting yourself in the shoes of the final girl. It's like when I watch those particularly the slashers, I'll watch them through the lens of the final girl, but I'll also imagine myself in their situation.
Yes.
So when we look at sort of contemporary final girls, then how do you see that they've evolved, and what are your thoughts about where we are right now with the final girl?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting that, and Carol Clover talks about this in Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which is where we got the term final girl. The final girl is a mirror of the killer in those older slashers. She's sort of the opposite of him. She has to become him for a moment in order to defeat him. And you can't have a final girl without the story about this killer. I think what's evolved over time is that final girls of today, more often we're hearing their story. And it's not so reliant on, we want to tell a story about this masked boogeyman, and here happens to be his foil who ends up being the final girl. It's often more, we want to tell a story about people or a particular event, or even we want to tell a story about this particular woman, this final girl. And here's her foil, and the killer might be kind of secondary to her. And a lot of the sequels that are bringing back Final Girls to explore them, whether or not you think they're nailing it, they're trying to explore the Final Girls story. And so I think over time, as women have carved out a bigger place for themselves in horror and in the world, I think that gives us room in horror movies to say, you know what, here's a story about a person you didn't hear before, but this story has meaning, and these feelings of being a final girl don't go away. So that's how I think it's changed over time, and I think it'll never go away because there's always going to need to be retelling of their stories.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel that when we talk about Final Girls, it's something very close to many of our hearts as a community, but also we all come to horror as individuals with different experiences and thoughts. So I'd be interested to hear what's your personal experience with Final Girls and what do they mean to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, a lot of my introduction to horror was through slashers. And I think that that's true for a lot of us. I think, especially people our age, as we were able to access the slashers of the 70s and the 80s, and then had the slasher boom in the 90s after Scream. So I do love slashers, and I love lots of different kinds of horror. But a lot of my introduction was in this formulaic slasher film. And so a lot of the first characters that I ever really got to cheer for or, try to get behind happened to be final girls. So a lot of my early experiences of horror have to do with those cathartic moments when she gets away, or when she gets to stab the killer and then run farther, whatever, however it might be that she's getting one over on him and defeating him. So um, I also think in a lot of those older slashers, the only women we got were either final girls or victims. Um, Rarely was there a lot of nuance for a woman is a killer or a woman is another character who is helpful in some way. So a lot of the females that I saw in horror movies either died or were final girls. So I was going to get behind the final girls. So it does have it definitely did affect my early horror fandom in a positive way.
And so you've chosen to talk about Valerie in the original Slumber Party Massacre, which is a very off-center choice that I absolutely love that you picked Valerie. Can you tell us more about your experiences with Valerie and what she means to you?
Yes. So I was a little bit late to the party with Slumber Party Massacre. I didn't watch it for the first time until a few years ago, and now it's become a favorite and it's a total comfort watch. I throw it on in the background all the time. So I can't say that I have a long history with Valerie, but um, I did feel an immediate connection to that movie and to her. So in Slumber Party Massacre, Valerie is not one of the girls at the slumber party. There's this main group of girls having a slumber party, which is where the massacre starts to happen, and Valerie is across the street. She had been invited to the party, but she didn't really feel welcome because some of the girls at school earlier that day were saying mean things about her and bullying her, and she's a new girl. And so she's invited, but she doesn't really feel invited, and she stays home to watch her little sister. And so she has this vantage point on the slumber party massacre that's taking place, where she can see something is wrong in the house across the street, like something bad is happening, and she decides if she wants to intervene or not. And so some things that really resonate with me about Valerie, she seems like a regular person to me, and she doesn't ever turn into some superhero. And I actually really like that, just because it feels more like I'm a regular person, so maybe I could be like Valerie. Um, she makes a choice to help people. She makes a choice to stay home and watch her little sister and play, like, they have a playful relationship. She does her sister's hair. She you can tell Valerie has this caring, empathetic presence about her. And then she makes a choice to go across the street and help. And that's not something that she had to do. And you could definitely talk about like, you don't have to put yourself in harm's way to help people. And sometimes putting yourself in harm's way is not a good way to help. Maybe it would have been better if she would have called the police, but this is a slasher movie, so that's not what we're doing. But so again and again in the movie, she makes decisions to help people. She also makes a decision to protect herself and decide, I don't want to go to this party where I'm going to feel picked on all night. I'm going to stay home instead. And so a lot of the decisions she makes feel really relatable to me. And she, at the end of the film, she chases the killer. And, I said she doesn't feel like a superhero, and that's true, but it does feel like a really heroic moment when she decides, no, I'm not done with you. You can't get away from this. And she chases him and ultimately kills him. And then at the end of the movie, she's crying with her sister and the party host, Trish, who also survived. And that just felt like another real moment to me, too. Like she did what she had to do, but now she is not okay having gone through that. And it shows these women helping each other through that tough moment. So Valerie really sticks with me because she feels like a real person as much as you can in an 80s slasher. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that Slumber Party Massacre was written and directed by women. And so definitely there was female input on this character.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of the discussion this evening's been about final girls not being alone and women working together. And that's obviously something that's very present in Slumber Party Massacre as well. And, potentially Valerie's like the facilitator for that, which I really like. So in closing then, where do you see the final girl in the next 5-10 years, and how do you think she will be remembered?
Yeah, I think we expand our definition of the final girl, and I think we continue to have women characters in horror movies that aren't final girls. I think yes, we need more final girls, and we need different stories and a variety of unique perspectives, and we need women who are killers, women who are boogeymen, women who are support characters who may or may not survive. So I think just as horror needs to change with the times and become more diverse with the times, so do the horror characters, including the final girl. So I think we will get to see, I hope we get to see more and more diverse stories about different kinds of women who survive different kinds of stuff. And I know that that's very vague, but that's purposeful because I want to see it be something big.
Oh, I love that. No, I couldn't agree more. And you've got some amazing articles on Ghouls about Slumber Party Massacre, the franchise, haven't you? Not just the first film, but the other films in the series.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me the space to write. I wrote a 2-part piece on the Slumber Party Massacre series and the feminist messages that are in it. So certainly you can watch those movies and turn your brain off and have a wonderful time with slashers, especially the second one. But there's also a lot there to analyze in movies that were written and directed by women in a particular time where slashers were not super feminist. So yeah, you can check those out.
And so then, before I let you go about your day, could you just share where people can find you online so we can keep abreast of all your fantastic articles and podcasts that you are a guest on, and I'll make sure that they're shared after this discussion.
Yeah, thank you. So I post everything on my Twitter at Ari_Hellraiser. And I am active on Letterboxd as well under the same name. So all my writing and all the podcasts I've been lucky to guest on, it's all going to go up on Twitter. So if you just follow me there, you'll see it all.
Thanks so much, Ariel. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And now, our fourth and final guest of the evening, last but by certainly no means least, I would now like to welcome the wonderful Lakaya Palmer.
Hi.
Hello, Lakaya. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm grand, thank you. Yeah, I know that you and me have connected a lot over Final Girls. We've shared a lot of messages and voice notes about one particular Final Girl that we'll get to in a moment, I'm sure. But before we do, would you just like to share a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm Lakaya Palmer. I'm currently a first-year PhD student at UCL, and I'm looking at the depiction of monstrous fathers in American horror cinema from the 1970s to 1991.
And you're also one of our fantastic contributors at Ghouls, aren't you? And I think you've got some articles on moving pictures as well. So yeah, your work is incredible, and you know the stuff you're doing with your research is just absolutely fascinating. So, Men, Women, and Chainsaws. Then it's a book that I think is in both of our collections. When Carol Clover talks about the Final Girl, and we often think of the slasher boom of the 70s and 80s. I'd love to hear your thoughts about why so many decades since then we're still so obsessed with the Final Girl, and what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think, when the term the Final Girl was introduced, before the kind of rise of slasher cinema and such of the 70s and 80s, women in horror had often been the victim, right? They've often been the victim, usually at the hands of a man, or maybe a creature or something. But I think for the first time in the 70s and 80s, we were seeing the rise of like strong female characters. And I think it's such a prominent thing for those that like the horror genre, because like I said before, this kind of period of like Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and so on, we weren't really getting those strong female characters as much. And I think that's why people love the term so much, because we hope to embody everything that the Final Girl embodies herself. And yeah, I feel like they're such inspirational characters, although, the term kind of is in contention now when looking at the definition and stuff, because typically the Final Girl was masculinized, and Clover believes that her masculinization is the only reason why male audiences would identify with her on screen. Not going too heavy into the realms of psychoanalysis, but usually we see the Final Girl defend herself with a phallic object, which Freud would argue compensates for her lack of a penis. And then in her having that phallic shaped object, she becomes complete. She's completed as she no longer lacks. So a little bit problematic, perhaps, looking at it from that angle, but nevertheless very influential for its time.
Yeah, and so when we look at recent Final Girls, what are your thoughts about, the types of Final Girls we're seeing now and how she's evolved since the 70s and 80s?
It's really interesting because although we do still get Final Girls, I feel like we are seeing more the rise of Final Boys and Final Groups now as well. An example that sticks out to me is Chris, I believe, from Get Out. Really strong Black male that actually survives until the end of a film, which again, we don't really see too much in the horror genre. And then thinking of Final Groups, I'm thinking more of a Fear Street franchise, with Dina, her brother, and her friends overcoming the sordid sheriff. So I feel like it has evolved now to not just being, like the Final Girl. And even though we do still see her, she's not just in the realms of the slasher genre now. We have Tomzin in The Witch, which is folk horror. We have like kind of a rise of, monstrous motherhood, I'd say, as well, in like films like The Babadook and films like that. So maybe that's the final girl evolved as well. Instead of battling with a mass killer, like in The Babadook, she's dealing with the horrors of her real life and coming to terms with like being a mother and so on. So maybe it's kind of evolved in that way as well.
So it's going off in all different directions, which can only be a fantastic thing, right?
Yeah, it's really nice to see it evolve.
And so final girls are, I know, like, they're so important to me and you, and we're really passionate about them, and as a horror community we love them. But obviously everyone comes to horror with different experiences, and I would be interested to hear what's your personal relationship like with the final girls.
The final girl is everything that I want to be in life. You know, like just embodying this really strong essence, and no matter what life throws at you, no matter the obstacles you have to face, getting up and fighting back. And I think that's a really important thing when dealing with representation as well, especially of women in genres, because you often see like the submissive woman, the transgressive woman, the victimized woman. And I think the final girl is just so much more than those categories. She's everything. Like, she really feels like a real life character. You can apply her to like everyday situations that you may go through. And I feel like there's something so beautiful in that, because it's so rare to identify with a representation so much. And I think that's why I really love final girls. I think they're really important, especially for dealing with like trauma, dealing with the horrors of real life that we may go through, and seeing someone on screen that we can identify with and look to. Of course, a little bit of a limitation that we don't really see many women of color final girls, but that's kind of changing, which is a nice thing. But yeah.
No, I'm often trying to channel the final girls in day-to-day situations. I am, at least in my head, a final girl. So you've chosen to talk about Sally in the 1974 Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is my favorite horror film. So I was super excited that you picked Sally, and I just can't wait to hear your thoughts about it. So please, Lakaya, tell us about your experiences with Sally and why she's so special to you.
Okay, so really interestingly, right, I'd never actually watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre until last year. Just kind of avoided it. I don't know, I'm not like the biggest fan of slashers. I'm more of a folk horror gal myself. So for a long time, my favorite final girl was actually Thompson in The Witch. But I watched the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it honestly just changed everything. Probably one of my favorite horror films now of all time. And I think what I really liked about Sally was no matter how hard she was getting knocked down, she fought and fought until she escaped. And I think the most horrifying thing is I was really like championing her on to like, escape the dysfunctional family and Leatherface, and she escapes, and I'm like, phew, like, good for you, Sally, like, well done. And then she gets recaptured.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it, having gone through all of that, just to be recaptured and then kind of tortured at the dinner table, right, with the scene where they're all there and taunting her, and she thinks she's going to get her head smashed in by Grandpa. I really felt it for the girl. And then no matter what, she still persisted and found the willpower to escape. And I just think that is such a wonderful thing to embody. And I kind of see myself in her. especially in relation to, not the same, but maybe like my academic life. You know, as I said, I'm doing a PhD and getting knocked down with the rejections from the funding. And I was like, I can't do it anymore. I can't do it. But it's that persistence, right? That really is everything, and just never giving up. And you'll end in the place where you're meant to be. And I feel like that's definitely what happened with Sally. So it was just amazing to watch that kind of embodiment on screen. And I think she's great. I think she was a great character as well.
Yeah, it's sort of like, it's an echo of what we said earlier about if we can watch these final girls survive these extreme circumstances, it helps engender us self-belief and, like you say, that persistence to keep on going.
Yeah.
So if we look to the future then, where do you see the final girl going? How would you like to see her evolve next? And what do you think her legacy is going to be in 5 or 10 years' time?
That's such an interesting question. And it's one, honestly, I'm not 100% sure about, because I think on the one hand, we can see this rise of kind of like horror films that's like more inclusive now. And, you know, we're getting different representations, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, it's happening, but maybe not quick enough. I can think of few Black women final girls, like very few, probably could count them on my 10 fingers, right?
Yeah.
Compared to the stereotypical white female final girl, it's not enough. So I really hope that it changes in that aspect. But also seeing the rise of final boys and groups as well, I really do love how that's evolving, because I feel like in horror films there is this trope against men and masculinity, and it's like they're usually the perpetrators of violence, right? So again, it's kind of reinforcing negative gender stereotypes, when actually no, like it'd be interesting to see more men and boys surviving, you know, like a mass killer or the horrors of family life as well. I feel like that's definitely a terrain that could be explored more. And also, I know Netflix has a show now called The Final Girls, or The Final Girls. I'm not sure, I haven't watched it, but that seems to be in quite like a group setting. So maybe like women tuning into each other's power and things like that to survive. I think that's a beautiful thing as well, like really emphasizing kind of female friendships and how using their power and essence combined, they can overcome whatever the obstacle is. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see how it actually does evolve into the future, and, you know, getting more representations of different genders and dynamics. I think that'd be great.
It's all up for grabs, isn't it? And hopefully, you know, we can see it go in as many directions as possible. So thanks so much for joining me, Lakaya. It's been fantastic. I'm sure we'll catch up again soon, and yeah, there'll be some final girl talk involved. But before you leave us, could you just share your social links so we can follow you online and just keep it ahead of all your amazing articles and the podcasts that you guest on?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm mainly active on Twitter, which is at Lakaya P. And if you go to the link in my Twitter bio, you'll be able to read all my articles and see all the podcasts I've guest starred on. And my Instagram is at Lakaya Palmer, if you want to check that out as well. And of course, I've written some amazing articles for my lovely friends at Ghouls Magazine, which are available at their website as well. So check me out.
Thanks so much, Lakaya. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
You too.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So that just about wraps up this evening's Ghouls Magazine panel discussion, The Ones Who Did Not Die, The Final Girls of Horror. Thanks to everyone for watching live, and for anyone who's watching this on playback, please don't forget to visit ghoulsmagazine.com for the latest editorials, reviews, and much, much more. You can also follow us on socials. We're on Twitter at Ghouls Magazine and Instagram at Ghouls Mag. Extra special thanks to my incredible final ghouls, Jerry Sampson, Jen Adams, Ariel Powershrub, and Lakaya Palmer for joining me tonight. You've been fantastic, and I will make sure all your links are shared after this discussion, so keep a lookout for those, everybody. I would just like to say a sentimental thank you to the Final Girls of Horror for uplifting and inspiring us, and for constantly giving us a safe place to process our fears. And before I go, I will just end on a final quote from Carol Clover, author of Men, Women and Chainsaws. Watchful, intelligent and resourceful, she survives what has come to seem unsurvivable. She is the most likely to linger in the memory, the one who did not die. She is the final girl. Thanks so much for joining me, everybody. Take care and see you all soon.